Before this story begins, I need you to do something important. If you believe in courage, justice, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard, hit subscribe right now, because stories like this deserve to be told. And what you're about to hear is not just another late-night headline. It's a reminder that evil sometimes chooses the wrong target, and when it does, it learns a lesson it will never forget. The night it happened, the streetlights on Harbor Ridge flickered like they were too tired to keep watch, casting pale orange halos over cracked sidewalks and trimmed hedges that looked harmless in daylight but ominous after dark. And Emily Carter walked alone beneath them with her keys threaded between her fingers the way every woman learns to do, her pulse steady but alert, unaware that two men leaning against a dented pickup truck across the street had already chosen her as their hot entertainment for the evening. They had been drinking cheap beer, laughing too loudly, their words slurring together with the casual cruelty of men who had never been held accountable for anything. And when they saw her, alone, slim, seemingly distracted, their laughter quieted into something more focused, predatory, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Emily sensed them before she fully saw them, that ancient instinct whispering up her spine, and she adjusted her path slightly without, breaking stride, eyes forward, shoulders squared. But the taller of the two men peeled off from the truck and called out, "Hey, sweetheart, don't scream!" The words sliding through the air like oil on water, and the second man circled wide, cutting off her route back toward the main road. And in that moment, the world narrowed to footsteps, breath, distance, calculation. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed from the simple jeans and gray hoodie, from the loose ponytail, and unassuming sneakers, was that Emily Carter had spent 12 years in the United States Navy, 8 of those embedded in Special Operations Support, and the last 4 as one of the most highly trained close-quarters combat instructors attached to a classified joint task unit that worked closely with Navy SEAL teams. And although she didn't wear a trident on her chest, she had trained beside those who did, bled beside them, survived things these two men wouldn't last 5 seconds imagining. The taller man stepped closer, breath sour with alcohol, and reached for her arm, repeating more softly now, "Don't scream," as if he were doing her a favor. And that was the moment she let the mask drop. Not into panic, not into fear, but into something cold and precise. She pivoted on the ball of her foot before his fingers could close, her hand snapping up to trap his wrist while her other elbow drove backward into his throat with surgical accuracy, the impact cutting off his air and replacing his grin with a choking gasp. And before he could process what had happened, she rotated her hips and used his own forward momentum to send him crashing face first onto the asphalt, the sound of bone meeting pavement sharp and final. The second man swore and lunged from behind, but Emily had already mapped his position from the scrape of his boots, and she stepped aside just enough to let his tackle glance past her ribs, then hooked her foot behind his ankle and shoved between his shoulder blades, sending him sprawling over his partner in a tangle of limbs and confusion. "What the hell?" he started, but the sentence ended in a scream as Emily's knee dropped onto the radial nerve in his forearm, pinning him with controlled pressure that felt like fire shooting up his arm. And she leaned close enough for him to see her eyes, calm and utterly unafraid, and whispered, "You picked the wrong woman," before twisting just slightly more until he tapped frantically against the pavement, begging. The first man, bleeding from a split lip and broken nose, staggered up in a fury fueled by humiliation, and he pulled a folding knife from his pocket with shaking hands, snapping it open as he spat blood at her sneakers. But knives had been part of Emily's training since she was 19, and she didn't flinch. Instead, she rose fluidly, shifting her weight to create space, forcing him to commit first, and when he slashed wildly toward her midsection, she deflected his wrist outward with the heel of her palm while stepping inside his reach, her other hand striking the brachial plexus at the base of his neck with enough force to short-circuit his muscles. And as his knees buckled, she hooked his knife hand, torqued it downward, and applied a joint lock so fast and precise that the blade clattered to the ground before he realized he dropped it. She kicked it away, then used the same locked arm to guide him face down again, this time pressing her forearm across the back of his neck just hard enough to make breathing a privilege she controlled. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, not because anyone had called yet, but because this was still America, still a city that never truly slept. And Emily pulled her phone from her pocket with one hand while keeping the man pinned with the other, dialing 911 with the efficiency of someone who had done far more under far worse conditions. When the operator answered, her voice was steady, almost bored, as she reported, an attempted assault in progress and requested officers and medical assistance. specifying that one suspect might have a broken nose and the other possible nerve damage. The operator asked if she was safe, and Emily looked down at the two groaning men beneath her and replied, "Yes, ma'am, I'm safe," in a tone that carried layers of meaning. By the time the police cruiser screeched around the corner, lights painting the houses red and blue, Emily had both men secured face down with their own, belts binding their wrists, a technique she'd learned improvising restraints in environments where zip ties weren't always available. And she stood as the officers approached, hands visible, posture relaxed but ready. One officer, a broad-shouldered veteran with sharp eyes, took in the scene and then looked at her with something. Between confusion and respect. And as he cuffed the suspects properly, he asked what had happened. And she gave a concise, factual account without embellishment, omitting only the details that didn't belong in a public report. When they asked if she wanted to press charges, she didn't hesitate. And as the paramedics loaded the men onto stretchers, the taller one looked at her through swollen eyes and croaked, "You crazy! Who are you?" And she met his gaze, without emotion, and said, "The consequence," before turning away. The story might have ended there, a neat headline about self-defense and justice served, but real life rarely ties itself in bows. And 3 days later, Emily noticed a black SUV idling across from her townhouse longer than coincidence allowed, its windows tinted too dark for comfort. And though she felt no fear, she felt something sharper: recognition. The men she'd taken down were small-time criminals, but one of them, it turned out, was the younger cousin of a local gang affiliate who did not appreciate humiliation. And humiliation was exactly what had gone viral when a bystander's security camera footage leaked online, showing the entire failed assault in grainy but unmistakable detail. The clip had exploded across social media with captions praising the mystery badass woman, but it had also painted a target on her back. Emily had spent years operating in shadows where recognition was dangerous, and she understood escalation better than most. So when the SUV's engine finally growled away, she didn't dismiss it. She prepared. Preparation for her did not mean panic buying weapons or sleeping with the lights on. It meant patterns, surveillance detection routes, subtle changes to routine, checking blind spots and reflections, and a quiet call to an old colleague named Marcus, a retired SEAL who now worked private security and owed her more than one favor. She didn't explain everything over the phone, just enough to make him listen. And within 24 hours, he had eyes on her street from a nondescript sedan 2 blocks away. A week passed without incident, tension stretching thin but unbroken until the night her power went out. It was 2:13 a.m. when the hum of her refrigerator died and the house fell into absolute darkness. And instead of bolting upright in alarm, she opened her eyes slowly, listening. There, a faint crunch of gravel outside her back patio door. Whoever they were, they thought. Darkness gave them advantage. What they didn't know was that Emily preferred it. She slipped from bed soundlessly, retrieving a compact flashlight and a legally owned firearm from her nightstand safe. Not because she intended to fire, but because she believed in options. And she moved through her home with the familiarity of someone who had cleared far more hostile structures. The patio door handle rattled once, then again more forcefully, and a shadow shifted against the curtain. Emily flicked her phone to life long enough to send a single pre-typed message to Marcus, "Now." And then she killed the screen and waited just off the door's angle. The glass shattered inward as a gloved hand reached through to unlock it, and the first intruder stepped inside, whispering to someone behind him, "She won't scream." The same phrase from that first night, and something almost like dark humor flickered through her mind at the repetition. She moved before his second foot cleared the threshold, slamming the flashlight into his wrist to knock whatever he held free. Another knife, then driving her shoulder into his chest to propel him backward into his partner. They stumbled, disoriented by resistance they hadn't anticipated, and she used the doorway as a funnel, preventing them from spreading out. One swung blindly, catching her upper arm with a glancing blow that stung but did no real damage, and she responded by sweeping his legs and dropping him hard onto the broken glass he'd created. A sharp lesson in consequences. The second intruder recovered faster than she'd hoped and lunged low, tackling her around the waist, and they crashed into the kitchen island with enough force to rattle dishes, his weight heavy but not immovable. She let herself fall backward deliberately, using the momentum to roll and trap his arm between her thighs, applying a triangle choke she'd drilled 1,000 times, and within seconds, his struggles weakened as oxygen deprivation did its quiet work. She released before permanent damage, shoving him aside and rising just as headlights flared through her front windows, and a voice boomed outside, identifying itself as private security. Marcus and two of his team stormed in through the now open front door, weapons drawn but controlled, and took in the scene of two incapacitated intruders amid shattered glass and overturned stools. Police followed minutes later, summoned by both Marcus and Emily, and this time the charges escalated to home invasion and attempted assault with deadly weapons. Under interrogation, the men admitted they'd been paid to teach her a lesson, though they claimed not to know by whom, but the trail led predictably back to the gang affiliate nursing wounded pride. What none of them had known, what even Marcus hadn't fully grasped, was that Emily's time in service hadn't ended quietly. She had left active duty after exposing procurement fraud within a contracting chain tied to organized crime, a decision that had earned her enemies with deeper pockets than street-level thugs. And as federal investigators reopened old files in light of the recent attacks, a larger pattern emerged, linking the local gang to a distribution network under scrutiny for years. Suddenly, Emily was not just a victim defending herself, but a catalyst in a broader crackdown. Federal agents visited her kitchen, now repaired, asking careful questions about her past assignments, about names she hadn't spoken in years, and she answered what she legally could, aware that every truth carried risk. The twist she hadn't expected came when one of the agents, a composed woman in her 40s, closed the folder and said quietly, "We were hoping you'd surface again," revealing that Emily's earlier whistleblowing had never been forgotten, and that certain people in Washington had long suspected retaliation attempts. The home invasion had provided the probable cause needed to dismantle the local network entirely. Over the next month, arrests rippled outward like shockwaves, from the cousin who'd sought revenge to the financiers who'd funded intimidation campaigns against anyone who threatened their operations. And though Emily's name never appeared in official press releases, whispers circulated in law enforcement circles about the woman who fought back. Life did not return to exactly what it had been. Trauma leaves fingerprints even on the strong, but it settled into something steadier. The black SUV never returned. The streetlights still flickered but felt less ominous, and neighbors who once hurried inside after dark now nodded to her with newfound respect, unaware of the full story, yet sensing its weight. One evening, weeks later, Emily stood on her porch watching a summer storm roll in, thunder rumbling like distant artillery, and she thought about the phrase that had started it all, "Don't scream," and how often it had been used to silence, to control, to diminish. She had not screamed that night, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't need to. Strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, patient and disciplined, until the moment action is required. And somewhere in a holding cell, two men who once believed vulnerability equaled weakness replayed the memory of asphalt against their faces and realized too late that the world is full of people whose calm hides capability, whose quiet hides training, whose ordinary hides extraordinary resolve. If there is a lesson in this, it is not merely about combat or revenge, but about preparedness, about the unseen histories every stranger carries, and about the profound mistake of underestimating someone based on appearance alone. So remember this story. Share it. Subscribe for more truths that remind us what resilience looks like in real life. And never forget that sometimes the most dangerous words a predator can utter are "don't scream," because the woman they say it to might just be the one who ensures they never threaten anyone again.